We are delighted of the opportunity of running yet another event here in your headquarters. So thanks a lot really for all your support. As the director of the DCU Brexit Institute, it is really my great pleasure to be able to introduce Joaquín Almunia, who will open today's event on Brexit and financial services. This conference focuses on one of the most important economic sectors to be affected by the decision of the UK to withdraw from the European Union, and we are pleased to partner with GSK Luxembourg for this initiative. Most of you will know Joaquín Almunia, particularly in his role as former European Commissioner for Economic and Financial Affairs, but I think a proper introduction is due, not least because Joaquín has been so kind to fly from Madrid within the day to address this audience. So let me just say a couple of words of introduction. A native of Bilbao in the Basque countries, Joaquín studied law and economics, graduating from the University of Deusto, and subsequently he spent time at the École Pratique des Hautes Études in Paris and at the Kennedy School of Government in Harvard, Massachusetts. After serving as the chief economist of the Unión General de Trabajadores, he joined the Spanish Parliament, the Cortes Generales, with the Socialist Party, and in the 1980s he moved on to serve first as Minister of Employment and Social Security and then as Minister of Public Administration. After the departure of Felipe González, Joaquín then took over the helm of the Socialist Party of Spain, and he acted as the leader of opposition during the government of Aznar in the 90s, and he ran, although unsuccessfully, as candidate prime minister in 2000. In 2004, then, he was appointed the European Commissioner for Economic and Monetary Affairs, joining for a few months the Prodi Commission, and he remained in charge of that crucial portfolio for 5 years during the first Barroso Commission, at a time when, as you know, major developments occurred in the field of financial services. In fact, in 2010, Joaquín Almunia was reappointed as a member of the second Barroso Commission with responsibility over competition policy. And in that role, he was also stepped up to the post of Vice President of the European Commission, a position that he kept since 2014. Besides these impressive institutional achievements, however, Joaquín has also maintained a strong scientific profile. He has lectured for a number of years as an adjunct professor in university. He sits in the board of a number of think tanks, including CEPS and the European Policy Center, and he has been actively engaged in public debates on the future of Europe, and specifically economic and monetary union. And because of all these reasons, I really think he indeed represents the ideal speaker for an event like this one. As I'm always fond of saying, the DCU Brexit Institute endeavors to bring together speakers from different backgrounds, academia, governments, the institution, business, the professional world, creating a unique space in which to have an in-depth conversation on the challenges we are facing today. So we look for speakers who are versatile in multiple words, and I think given his experience as European Finance Commissioner and his expertise as an international economist, no one better than Joaquín is able to open our discussion on the implications that Brexit will have on financial services, including in the framework of the future relation between the EU and the UK. I think the timing of this event could not be more appropriate, given the recent European Council conclusions just a few weeks back. And I'm also very much looking forward, as I think you are, to hear the concluding keynote speech that will close today's event, which will be delivered by the Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Ireland, who is scheduled to give a major speech addressing the future of banking regulation in a post-Brexit world. So in order to maximize your time, I will refrain from adding anything else on the substance, and I'd rather give the floor to Joaquín, who I would like to sincerely thank again for accepting our invitation to come to the DCU Brexit Institute, which is Europe first and Ireland only center specifically focused on discussing the challenges posed by Brexit. So dear Joaquín, it's a great pleasure to welcome you here. Muchísimas gracias. Bienvenido.
Thank you very much, Fabrizio. Thank you very much to Arthur Cox and to Brian for their hospitality here. Thank you very much to the Dublin City University, the Brexit Institute. And of course, when Fabrizio sent me an invitation to come here to discuss how I see Brexit issues, I immediately reacted positively. I told him, let's find a date, a moment, a slot to go to Dublin is not as difficult as to go to any other place in Europe. The same distance flying from Madrid to Dublin than flying from Madrid to Brussels. And the flight Madrid-Brussels or Brussels-Madrid for me is like to take the car and go to the corner of my street in Madrid. So thank you very much. I am here very happy in Dublin. It's my first visit to Dublin and to Ireland since I left the European Commission, end of October 2014. I've been here as commissioner several times. I've been here many, many years before when I was Minister of Labor in the Spanish government in 1984, and we were negotiating the Spanish accession to the then European Community. I remember very well I paid a visit here to have contacts and conversations with the then Labour Minister of Ireland, my very good friend Joaquín, trying to learn how Ireland was using the structural funds and in particular the social fund. I was impressed by the use that Ireland was making of these resources. I tried to learn a lot, not to copy because our countries are different from many points of view, but to learn and to benefit from the experience of my Irish colleague and friend. And since then, I have been here in many occasions in my national political life, in my European political life, and in my life. Forgetting that I was a politician, also enjoying your country. So let's discuss today Brexit and financial services. Well, it's an extremely important issue, of course, not only for your institute, not only for the university, but for all the Europeans, because we know that the financial sector in the UK is an extremely important one, around 10% of the UK's GDP, that many activities from financial operators established in other countries of the EU are linked, strongly linked, with the existence of the financial sector in the UK, and in particular with the City of London. So all of us, not only the Brexit Institute, not only Irish, not only you as a neighbor and with your close links as a country with the UK, but all of the Europeans and beyond the European borders are extremely interested and in some occasions concerned by what will happen at the end of these negotiations. Let me start by just recalling in 1 minute the state of play of the negotiations for Brexit. The first phase, the phase where 3 points were put on the table by Michel Barnier, my former colleague in the Commission, following the mandate of the 27. They established, and I think it was a very, very correct decision, to start the Brexit negotiations trying to solve 3 points. The situation of our citizens, EU citizens living in the UK, or UK citizens living in the other countries, the other members of the EU. Second, the financial deals, not the financial services, but the financial deals to liquidate in a fair way the financial links between the UK as a member of the EU for 43 years and the other 27. And the third question, the Irish question, the Northern Ireland border and what will happen there. Well, the 3 points were, I would say, solved. I know that the third one, the Northern Irish border, is not really solved, but wait, these kind of political agreements allows us to continue the negotiations, but we will not forget that this question should be solved before the end of the negotiations. This first agreement, reached in December last year, allowed the EU27 to authorize the opening of the second phase. Now we are in this period, since the last European Council in March, 1 month ago. or less than 1 month ago, and these negotiations of the second phase must be concluded in 6 months from now, around 6 months, because the last month before the 29th of March 2019 needs to be focused on the ratification of the agreements by the respective parliaments. This agreement, hopefully we will have an agreement, I hope so. It's not easy, but I hope there will be an agreement, will need to be composed by 3 different chapters. First, the so-called Withdrawal Agreement, the conditions for the UK leaving the EU, the transition, and there is an agreement by the 27 leaders that the transition can be accepted with a deadline at the end of 2020, and the framework, the general framework for the future relationship that will establish the status quo of the UK as a third country and the EU 27. And as always, in these kind of negotiations, we have a principle that is accepted by both sides, that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. But this is the general state of play. The UK set up original red lines. This was not a referendum decision, as you know. This was a Mrs. May government decision to set up red lines to try to define the UK position in the negotiations. And these red lines, British red lines, have started to fade. But still a lot of uncertainties remains about what will be the final position of the UK so as to allow Mrs. May, or the Prime Minister in the UK, if she is not there next year, to sign the final agreement for the UK leaving the EU. And the EU also have red lines, the non-divisibility of the 4 freedoms of the single market, the principle that the leaving member cannot be better off outside the EU than within the EU. And from the EU point of view, these red lines stay firm. And all the 27, very different countries with a lot of discussions in many other areas, but on these principles, all of the 27 governments and leaders stay firm behind these red lines from the EU position. And finally, from these introductory remarks, I don't see real possibilities to go backwards and to reverse Brexit before the end of the deadline. I know that some British Remainers, some of them very good friends of mine, try to reverse Brexit before it's too late, but I really don't see how this can be made possible. It's very, very difficult after the referendum result, and after what happened since June 2016 until now. I don't see many possibilities. I see very, very few possibilities to reverse Brexit. So, in my view, Brexit will really take place. What we don't know is what will be the final picture of the transition period, of the withdrawal agreement, and of the final status quo. I now come to the financial services part of the negotiation. What will be the future regime for financial services? The solution is still to be found. Right now, it's unknown. Nobody can say, I know how this negotiation will finish when it comes to look at the relationship between the financial services and the financial sector in the UK and the similar activities in the other members of the EU. What we know is that if there is an agreement, there will be a transition period, in principle, from March next year until the end of 2020, so less than 2 years of transition period. And during this transition period, the UK accepts to continue to be inside the single market. They will be a third country, but abiding by the rules of the single market and of the customs union during this 21 months. This means that for this period, or during this period, the financial services in the UK and in the EU 27 will continue to have the same kind of regime than they have now, because the UK is member of the single market, and within the single market there are clear rules for the free provision of services, free establishment, passporting of financial players, and all these things. How to find the solution? From the EU point of view, as the UK had decided not to be part of the single market in the steady state after the end of the transition, the providers of financial services established in the UK will not benefit anymore of this passport. They will not be automatically allowed to operate in the markets in the territory of the EU 27. All the member states, all the 27 member states, support unanimously that the passport system will not be prolonged beyond the end of the transitional period. And this has very strong arguments behind this, because the single market means a progressive harmonization of rules or sharing common rules and regulations. But outside the single market, regulatory divergence exists by definition. Only the 3 countries members of the EEA, of the economic area, not members of the EU, but members of the single market, Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein, so Norway. Only Norway, as a relevant country with services, important services, has accepted the role of being a rule taker. They cannot decide, they cannot participate in the decisions of the regulations governing the single market, but they accept the outcome of this. And they know that they cannot negotiate at the same level that the member states how the next regulations will be. They have to accept. They can communicate their priorities or their concerns. They can discuss, of course, and they do it. But at the end, the decision is adopted by the members. And they take the rule and are abide by these rules, and they are bound by the rules. And because there is no common rules and regulations, and because there is no free movement of services, free provision of services, free establishment of providers of services within the single market, outside the single market, mutual recognition of different regulations cannot exist. And this is a very important issue, because from the UK side, the members of the UK government still continues to say that they want to reach an agreement including mutual recognition of different regulations. And in particular, they refer, when they talk about this, to financial services. Not only, but in particular, the most important concern are the regulations of the financial activities. I don't expect, I don't believe that the EU 27 will change this position and will be ready to politically negotiate the mutual recognition of different regulations. This will be the end of the single market, and no one of the 27 wants to destroy the single market. So I don't think mutual recognition can be accepted. And this is very clear now in the public statements and in the private conversations of the EU negotiators, but when the UK responsibles made the public statements, they continue to say this is our preferred solution, so let's fight to reach this solution. I think this is not realistic, that this is not possible. The last time I heard some crucial UK representative saying that mutual recognition is the outcome they want to achieve in these negotiations was last March, 1 month ago, when the Chancellor of Exchequer, Minister Hammond, says that financial services must be part of the future free trade agreement. Regulatory equivalence must be managed. It means politically negotiated through cooperation between the UK and the EU. So if this would be the case, a third country will be at the same level in the negotiation table with the 27, and this will not be possible. And I think in these kind of negotiations, maybe at the beginning, the first months, you can put forward your maximum demands and your maximum requests. But now, with only 6 months ahead of us, or less than 6 months, to conclude the negotiation, I think this is not wise to stick to these utopian positions that will never be accepted by the EU 27. Mrs. May, without going into the details that are obviously the task of Chancellor Hammond or the financial authorities or some other spokespersons of the financial sector, Mrs. May talked in her first speeches regarding the British position for the Brexit negotiation of the 3 baskets. One basket of things that will continue to be the same once the UK will abandon the EU. The second basket, issues, topics, policies, regulations that can diverge, but the divergence can be managed. And the third basket where differences doesn't matter, are not important and not relevant. This second basket, where they want to put the financial services, is not possible, it's not acceptable by the EU, and cannot be accepted, because this will imply the end of the single market as we knew it since the Single Act in the 80s, last century. There is another argument that, Hammond said in the last speech in last month, well, it's true that never a free trade agreement signed by the EU, and the recent free trade agreements, very important, with Korea, with Singapore, with Canada, are the ones Mr. Hammond had in mind. He said, never included this concept of regulatory divergence, and never included details on how financial services will be dealt in the relationship of the third countries signing free trade agreements with the EU. He said, but the UK case is a unique one because we are still members of the EU, so day one of the Brexit history, the regulations will be the same. And in our case, the question is to what extent divergence is possible and how we can manage this divergence. So he's asking the EU, please don't tell us what is possible in all the other cases, because our case is unique. Until March 2019, we continue to be members of the EU. There will be a transition period until the end of 2020. So our regulations are the same. Only from 1st of January 2021, we will start to diverge, and we can discuss how to diverge, how much to diverge, and what we do every time that we diverge. This is the British position, but this request of considering the British case, in particular for financial services, as a very particular one, is not acceptable by the EU 27, because there is a basic principle that can be understood quite well, knowing what the EU mean, that the EU regulations for the single market will never be submitted to a negotiation with a third country. The single market is an institution, rules, the 4 freedoms, the way to manage this free movement of goods, services, capitals, people, that is up to the EU members to decide how this can function, how regulations can be changed, how regulations can be interpreted, and who will give the final interpretation of these regulations enforcement, that is the European Court of Justice. And we are now here addressing two of the most important red lines of the British government: not to be members of the single market after Brexit, and not to be under the final decisions of the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg. So it's not the EU 27 who designed these red lines. It's the British government, so they need to be consistent with their own decisions that, again, were not decisions included in the questions submitted to the British people in the referendum. These are red lines that are the interpretation of the present British government and the majority of the Conservative Party in the House of Commons after the result of the referendum was known, with this 52 against 48%. The only solution found in the past was the Norwegian solution. Okay, let's play the game with the same rules. Let's be members of the single market, but as a rule taker. And I cannot believe that the UK will accept for the future being a rule taker of the single market. They only can accept this during the transition. And they have accepted that during the transition period, during these 21 months, they will be rule takers. But the day one, after the end of the transition, this is not possible. So if this is not possible, there will not be possible to have this passport system that because you are a financial institution, a financial entity operating in the territory of the single market, you are automatically allowed to operate in the whole single market. This is not possible. The equivalent system applies. That is the system that was invented to deal with third countries that are requesting to operate within the single market in some areas, in particular today, the financial services. And I quote the CEO of the think tank that was mentioned, CEPS, right, chairing in Brussels, Karel Lanoux, that is an expert in EU financial services regulations, that wrote recently what equivalence means. And I quote him: equivalence means that in certain cases the EU may recognize that a foreign legal, regulatory and/or supervisory regime is equivalent to the corresponding EU framework. Therefore, it allows the EU authorities to rely on the compliance of foreign entities with the equivalent foreign framework, stating that equivalence decisions may apply to the entire regulatory framework of a third country or to some of its authorities only. So, what it means is that the equivalence is decided unilaterally by the EU. Usually, the equivalence decision has been adopted by the Commission and prepared in cooperation with the Commission services, DG FISMA now, and with the advice of the European supervisory authorities, so the European Banking Authority, the European Financial Markets Authority, ESMA, and the third European Authority for the insurance sector. Every equivalence is decided unilaterally by the EU and is revocable at any time. It's the EU who decides this, and is an instrument that the EU can use and is using for the own benefit of the EU, not for the benefit of the others. What matters in the decision of equivalence are the European interests, not the interests of the others. Of course, the others are interested in operating within the single market, and we also are interested on this, but to declare equivalence is because we want to declare equivalence, and to revoke unilaterally equivalence is because we are no more interested in considering this third country legal framework as equivalent. So this possibility exists, of course, and needs to be used once the EU will sign with the UK Brexit and the transitional period will conclude. Of course, the EU, using this instrument of equivalence, can decide in many areas at the beginning that the regulatory framework of the UK is equivalent because it will be more or less the same. But once the regulatory divergence will start to operate, at one moment, the EU can decide to conclude the equivalence, and it's a fantastic instrument to avoid the race to the bottom. That is a risk, that the UK can be tempted to use, on the one hand, the power of the City of London, and on the other hand, the power to use unilaterally the new regulations to diverge towards the bottom to attract new financial activities or new financial operators, but they have to have in mind that the EU will always have in the EU hands the possibility to revoke equivalence. Right now, with the third countries, the Commission has adopted 40 different equivalence requirements covering the implementation of the Capital Requirements Directive, the last one, the MiFID II, the investment funds and asset manager regulations, the clearing houses regulations, the rating agencies, the insurance sector regulations, and so on and so forth. The way this equivalence regime will affect financial entities and market players on individual terms will depend on their organizational structure. So it's not an equivalence decision that can apply to all clearing houses. It depends how they are organized in their countries or how asset managers function one after the other. So can be individual equivalence decisions or for a group of financial players. And the precise regime for the future UK's status quo will have to deal with this, and this general framework, yes, will be negotiated. And probably, I am not sure, but probably will be included in the future free trade agreement, but the free trade agreement will not change the pillars of this EU approach to protect the single market and to keep the autonomy of the EU decisions in how the single market works, and of course, the autonomy, the full independence of the European Court of Justice to decide finally the regulatory disputes or the problems arising from the enforcement of regulations. So far, the EU has announced that the equivalence system needs to be reviewed and improved. And this has triggered the first reaction from the US side. The other day, a spokesperson of, I don't know, it was a spokesperson of one clearing house, of the spokesperson of the group of clearing houses, of the most relevant clearing houses, was complaining, saying, hey, now you can put into question the equivalence agreement that we reached with you some years ago because you want to put in a more strict level the consideration of equivalence for clearing houses because you want to attract to the continent or to Ireland the clearing houses that are right now are operating in London. Well, I don't know if this is right or wrong, but of course, this is a risk. For instance, Switzerland was preparing a negotiation. Switzerland is not in the single market, had bilateral agreements in many areas with the EU, and they were trying to improve the bilateral agreement with the EU regarding financial services, and they complained that the EU stopped the negotiation, and they know that this stop of the negotiation is because the EU will not want, before the end of the Brexit negotiations, to set up a particular regime with Switzerland. But this is the EU who decides, for good or bad reasons, I hope that will always be for good reasons, but it's in the hands of the EU to decide the future of this. The other recently, in the March, was a publication of a draft, first draft of the Withdrawal Agreement, covering a lot of areas, and financial services is not included in this draft that was endorsed in the last European Council at the end of March by the head of state and government. In this draft, there are still 25%, more or less, of the provisions had not yet been agreed with the UK negotiators, and 75% yes has been agreed. Financial services that not there were included into an annex that has not made public. Is not public. The annex referring to how the EU negotiators thinks financial services will be treated in the future withdrawal agreement. In any case, the Financial Times leaked one sentence of this annex saying the EU is trying to include in the final withdrawal agreement the need to give appropriate access, and it's a quote, appropriate access for the UK financial service providers to the EU 27 market. What it means, appropriate access, I don't know, and probably most of the people don't know. Some negotiators know, but they have not been ready to communicate to us what they have in mind when they talk about appropriate access. Of course, there is a common interest to reach an agreement. Nobody will benefit of Brexit, and nobody will benefit of the financial services chapter of Brexit. Everybody is at risk of having losses. But those who decided Brexit, of course, cannot be better off at the end. Once the agreement has been signed, it would be terrible if the weakness of the EU during the negotiations will allow the UK to be better off after Brexit. This will not be acceptable, and this would be terrible if this would happen for any reason that I don't think is possible. But just to make this clear, the British cannot be better off after Brexit, neither on financial services nor in many other areas of their relationship in the future with the EU. We know that after Brexit will be less presence of UK financial services activities in the continent or in Ireland, and less EU financial activities in the city. So the degree of interconnection that is very high will decrease. There is an open discussion about the consequences of these negative consequences of Brexit, but what will be and who will pay for that? Consequences: fragmentation of financial markets, higher costs for using financial services, loss of efficiencies and synergies, legal uncertainty regarding existing contracts, in derivatives, for instance, but in other kind of contracts, relocation of activities and jobs, difficulties to attract new talent for the City of London. Yes, all these are risks. The question is not to deny the existence of those risks that are there because Brexit was decided, but the question is how to distribute the negative consequences of Brexit. And it's obvious that from the EU perspective, the UK should pay a higher price. It's obvious. And it's not a threat, it's a logical conclusion of the situation. We didn't decide to go ahead with Brexit. They were their electorate who decided. Now they have to cope with the consequences of this decision. The financial sector accounts for about 10% of the total UK GDP, so it's not a small sector in the UK. The importance of the EU27 for the British financial system cannot be underestimated. 23% of the total UK banking resources are in the UK, 10% in the case of the insurance sector, 1/3 of the asset management business, and 50% of the clearing activities of the EU27 takes place in the UK. And 1/3 of the UK external surplus in the exchange of services with the rest of the world, 1/3 of the total surplus, that is a quite important one, comes from the EU27. That we are, all the other Europeans, we are importers of UK financial services. Probably in our case, in the EU27 case, probably also the losses will exceed the benefits, the potential benefits. So we will not have a tough position in the negotiation because we want to win and to benefit. We want to minimize losses. In my view, everybody will lose, but the UK probably will lose more and should or must lose more because they decided to embark us in this situation. The British financial authorities and the Bank of England are sending recently messages trying to seduce EU financial operators to stay in the UK. I don't know how they can keep the present promises. Of course, during the transition period, these promises are obvious because they will remain in the single market until the end of the transition. But the day after the end of the transition, I don't know how they can offer or for how long they can continue to offer the same conditions that the EU financial operators have now if they operate in the UK once the final status quo will substitute the presence of the UK in the single market. And they are criticizing the EU because the EU central banks, the ECB in particular, or the EU financial authorities are not giving to the British the same kind of pledge. I will treat you in the future in the same way that I will treat you right now. For them to reach this promise is very easy, is to decide to stay in the single market. But I think they will not decide to stay in the single market. So let's negotiate in an efficient way, keeping the cohesion among the 27, that so far is extremely strong. Let's understand that some European capitals, Dublin, Paris, Frankfurt, Amsterdam, are trying to receive some activities, some financial activities coming from the UK. It's a logic, we can understand this. I expect advances from the economic and monetary union point of view in the capital markets union and in the banking union because of the reality of the impact of Brexit on financial services, and this would be a big benefit for us, for our future, to increase the integration of the EU 27 or the EU 19 in the euro area in this capital markets union for the 27 and the banking union for the euro area members. But in any case, this would have been an obligation, a political responsibility, even without Brexit. So my assessment, finally, to sum up, is the final result of the negotiations concerning financial services is still up in the air. We cannot foresee now how this negotiation will finish. The UK, in any case, must not be better off after Brexit, and financial services cannot be an exception to the rule, that those who abandon should not be awarded, but should pay the price of their decision. The British red lines, as much as they are still valid, goes counter the interest of the British financial sector, and they know it. And in particular, if the only voters in the referendum would have been the people living or working in the City of London, of course, the result would have been extremely different. We all know this. The success of the city was due, in part, to the EU membership of the UK, and not against the EU regulations that have to be adopted by the UK as a member. The EU will not be, the EU 27 will not be a big beneficiary, but we have more possibilities in our hands if we continue to negotiate with the cohesion of the 27 to minimize the damages of Brexit in a much more clear way and less difficult way than the UK. The clarification of the final status quo of the UK in the relation in the future with the EU 27 must take place as soon as possible. I heard in the last weeks some voices coming from the financial services sector in the UK saying, well, now it's too late even to benefit for a transition period. The transition was a request. Let's get, as soon as possible, a commitment to have a long transition, not to go out of the single market day number one after Brexit. Now the transition has been agreed, but has been agreed maybe too late, and for their own interest, the transition maybe is too short, only until the end of 2020. I don't know if it can be prolonged in the future. I really don't know. But in any case, what the EU 27 or Euro area regulators, starting by the ECB, are sending us a message for financial institutions, telling them, please don't forget that the day where the UK will leave the single market will come. So you need to be, right now, prepared for the worst. Please prepare contingency plans. Please prepare strategies for the worst case scenario, that there is no agreement at all, or for the second worst scenario, that is Brexit without passporting, with difficulties for equivalence because of the regulatory divergence, and maybe will be too late if the contingency plans for the day where really Brexit will cut the links, the present links between the financial service in the UK and the financial services and the economy in the EU 27, these plans are only adopted during the transition period. Maybe will be too late. It's now, when all the financial institutions should be prepared, and if the final result is less worse than the one adopted as a central scenario in the contingency plans, okay, would be good. But if you are not prepared for the worst scenario, and the worst scenario comes, this will be a disaster. And this will be a disaster for the British financial services sector, of course, but we all of us, we will also pay the negative consequences. So I think the EU regulators are doing a good job on this. And my last word is, well, maybe Mrs. May, politically, will prefer an ambiguous statement at the end of the negotiations, when the House of Commons will have to vote the final withdrawal agreement with the transition period included in the autumn before the end of this year. Maybe she can prefer ambiguous provisions to try to manage the different wings and the different positions within her weak majority in the Commons. I can understand these temptations from the political point of view, but I think would be extremely bad for the financial institutions, because clarifications should come as soon as possible and should be as big as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joaquín, for this clear-cut presentation. I think you didn't fudge the question, and indeed you deserve, I think, some water. Yeah. So we have about 10-15 minutes for question and answer. I'm sure there will be many interest from the audience in asking for clarification and follow-up question. I will simply open the floor with a request to please identify yourself and try to keep your questions and remarks as brief as possible.
Thank you. I'm from the Slovak Embassy here in Dublin. Maybe more an observation than a question. Just yesterday I spoke with a few investors and bankers from the city, from Dublin, from London, because they here on the venture capital conference. Few of them told me they don't see any moves or any plans or anything that would be happening in the city towards Brexit. Everything still runs the same as it used to be a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and nobody knows what's going to happen. Would you comment on that as well? Thank you.
Well, they are wrong. Well, let me be frank. in my experience of the years before 2007, 2008, nobody was prepared for this big financial crisis. Even at the beginning of the financial crisis, nobody believed that Lehman can go bust. Even when Lehman went bust, almost nobody believed that this will have very negative consequences at the other side of the Atlantic. When the consequences arrived from this side of the Atlantic, here in Dublin, or in some German banks, or in some British banks, many people said, okay, this will be a financial turbulence. We are used to these financial turbulences from time to time. We can manage it, and we can sort out the situation with some more expansionary fiscal policy, 1.5% of the GDP, and so on, and so on, and so forth. So in this case, I think if there are no contingency plans prepared, first, to cope with the risk, I hope will not be a high risk, but there is a risk of a no agreement, of the cliff scenario that the British called. If there are no contingency plans of what will happen the day the transition period will come to an end, even if there is an agreement before March 2019, December 2020 will be very close, and 1st of January 2021, nobody will have the solution to the risk that the first regulatory divergence from the third country called the UK vis-à-vis the EU financial regulations will put into doubt the equivalence requirement requested to the Commission to operate in the EU 27 territory and markets. So I have not been involved in the private sector. Have always been in the labor unions, in the political sphere, national, but I think contingency plans, even in politics, are very useful, but in particular in the financial activities.
Hi, thanks very much. Gavin Barrett, I'm a professor in UCD. I just wanted to go back to the length of the transition period. As far as I'm aware, in the history of the European Union, no trade agreement has ever been negotiated in a period of time as short as that now proposed for the transition period. So isn't it making it impossible to reach an agreement, not alone in the financial services area, but generally? And isn't it inevitable, therefore, that it is going to be need to be extended? And just a question as well, why is the transition period being made so short?
Well, first of all, the future free trade agreement, so the agreement that will set up the conditions for the final status quo, will not be signed before the end of the transition. What has been decided by the head of state and government in the last European Council, last March, so less than 1 month ago, is to authorize the EU negotiators to start talking about the future free trade agreement, FTA. And the FTA should be negotiated from now until or before the end of the transition period. But maybe the transition period will come to an end without a free trade agreement that will continue to be negotiated. What will happen if there is no free trade agreement? It will depend on the decisions adopted by the UK authorities, because are they who don't want to stay in the customs union? They are they who have decided not to stay in the single market, and they are they who will decide in the future the degree of regulatory divergence. So I understand that it's not easy to negotiate a free trade agreement in 1 year and a half, 1 year and 9 months, but the problem had not been created by the part of the negotiation called EU. The problem is on the other hand. What can happen if the transition agreement will need to stay for a longer period? From the point of view of the EU, my guess is that will not be an insurmountable difficulty from the point of view of the EU. The only difficulty from the EU, the only real difficulty is that 31st of December 2020 is the end of the present period of financial perspectives. And of course, the next financial perspectives, the next pluriannual financial framework for the EU budget from 2021 until 2027 will not be a period where the 27 will consider the UK will continue to be a member of the EU. So from the budgetary point of view, they will create some difficulties, and the UK, if they want to prolong the transition beyond 2020, or if they want to keep some participation, as Norway is doing in the research programs or in other activities, they will need to contribute. The political difficulties will be more on the UK side, because the elections took place last year, the next elections is 2022, maybe the stability in the majority in the Commons will not be as solid as Mrs. May will wish, and maybe elections will need to be called before the end of the 5-year mandate, and to call elections saying, I want to prolong the transition, meaning I want to prolong the period where I stay in the customs union and I stay in the single market, being a rule taker, would be very difficult. But these are not the problems of the 27.
Joaquín, first of all, thank you for a fantastic presentation. And Owen O'Neill is my name, I'm the president of the British Irish Chamber of Commerce. Just a question I have, a lot of what you've spoken about is predicated on business having the transition period to plan through and to work through, financial services to be able to work through that. But what if we don't get a deal? If we don't get a scenario where we don't have a deal in March 19? And, you know, behind this are real people and real jobs and families who may have to make decisions to move from the City of London or move out and move into different countries and elements of that. And that's a key concern. And I'm just interested in from your experience in relation to negotiations, you know, will we get to the point where we can use the transition period, or is the worst case scenario likely to be a factor as we approach?
Of course, if there is no agreement, and the 29th March 2019 at midnight, the UK will live without transition, without agreement, and without agreement there will not be transition, will be a disaster, a complete disaster. So what I tend to think is that, but it's a political judgment, is that because this disaster will create much higher costs for the UK side and from the EU 27 side, but will be a disaster for everybody. I said that Brexit is bad for everybody. The question is how to distribute during the negotiation the costs. If there is no agreement, be a much bigger disaster, and of course, I think the cost, the prices will be much higher for the UK. This will need to be avoided. And in particular, those who had more to contribute for the elimination of this high risk are the British negotiators, because the red lines are their invention, are not in the EU rules, are not in the EU treaties. The red lines, no single market, no customs union, no European Court of Justice, no budgetary contributions, no. This is in the British side. So I tend to think that they will be ready to blur a little bit more the red lines, just to avoid this. And there is a trade-off. It's obvious that there is a trade-off between things that needs to be clarified before the agreement, before the end of the year, and things that can remain ambiguous to be clarified during the transition period. And the second trade-off is how long will be the transition period. The EU said until the end of 2020. Maybe some voices in the Commons or in the British parties will say, hey, please, let's prolong this. What cannot be prolonged is the deadline of March 2019. This is in the treaty, in Article 50 of the treaty, and will require unanimity. And it's very difficult to imagine that for that purpose, unanimity can be reached of the 27. So the concerns affect all of us. The solutions, the political solutions to avoid these high risks are mainly in the hands of the British negotiators. By the way, just to talk about my friends of the Labour Party, when I say the responsibilities on the UK side, I am not only thinking, I'm mainly thinking of Mrs. May and the Conservative Party, but not only. Also the Labour has some things to do.
Howard Anane, solicitor, and thank you very much for your presentation. I just wondered, is there any possibility at all or any way that the negotiations could be extended on some pretext or another almost indefinitely until not only members of the government in Britain change and composition of Westminster Parliament, but maybe on the other side as well, in the European Commission or whatever, that personalities might over time change and maybe a different attitude?
Article 50 of the treaty, that is the legal base for the request to abandon the EU, states clearly that there are 2 years since the day the formal request to leave the Union is presented. It was presented 29th of March 2017, so the final day of the negotiations, 29th of March at midnight 2019. And the treaty says if you want to prolong this negotiation, you will require the unanimity of member states and the majority of the parliament, if I remember well. But unanimity of the member states of the 27 is a clear condition. Unanimity, yeah. Let's imagine here, given that we're in Ireland, unanimity is also the level of support to change tax regulations at the EU level.
Embassy of Brazil in Dublin. From the point of view of financial centers within the European Union, which of them could be benefited from the Brexit scenario and relocation of resources from the City of London to other financial centers in Europe? Thank you.
Well, given that we are in Dublin, probably most of the audience will say Dublin. If we were in Paris, well, they will say Paris.
I was about to ask the same question.
Bien sûr, bien sûr. If we were in Frankfurt or in Berlin, they will say Frankfurt. Maybe in Amsterdam, they will dare to say, hey, we also have a strong tradition of financial activities, also financial bubbles, by the way. The first one in the economic history took place in Amsterdam, the tulips. And even in my own country, in Madrid, you can here and there watch to some faces that say, yeah, why not Madrid? We are a very fantastic financial cluster with strong banks and experiences and sunny days and all this. But seriously, I think on this order, Frankfurt, Paris, Dublin is my personal bet. Sorry, Ambassador.
I was hoping we could end the session with a positive note for Ireland. I think there's always a lot of concern in this country for Brexit, but many people think that a positive note might be exactly the fit of financial services, but you're less optimistic about this as well for the country, so we will have to follow these 5 closely.
Well, I have to say that the most optimistic ones, who asked about what he heard in the city, one day I went to the city after I left the commission, so when Brexit had been decided, and one Spanish friend working there told me, Joaquín, but it's impossible to leave the City of London. So they are optimistic also, so far.
Okay, that's an optimistic note to conclude. Joaquín, it was a great pleasure to host you here. Thank you very much for all of you.
Okay, thank you.